Hey everyone, it's Asmara and welcome back to the channel. Happy Women's History Month and International Women's Day. As you guys know, on this channel, I love talking about the intersection of gaming and social issues, and today is certainly no exception. So throughout Black History Month, I went back and revisited several of my existing content that brings up topics relating to Black issues and identity in the gaming space, and I want to do something similar for Women's History Month. So today I'm revisiting a clip from my live discussion I did called Play Inequity in the Forgotten Form of Self-Care. And the clip I pulled is about gender-based inequity and ways that girls and women are oftentimes socialized to not experience an unbridled play state and some of the effects that that can have in their adult lives. A topic I've brought up on my channel before is this idea of why girls aren't necessarily considered gamers nearly as much as men. I definitely think things are changing, in modern day, but there's still some stereotypes about who gamers are, what they're supposed to look like, or if girls are seen playing games, sometimes there is a stereotype we have of like what a girl gamer is into and likes, and sometimes those games can be seen as not legit, not real games, and not worth our time nearly as much. And I think a lot of this research about gender-based play inequity can provide some context into why we may not consider girls as gamers nearly as much, and also why many girls may not think gaming is a hobby that may be for them. But of course, play can manifest itself in many ways, not just in playing a video game, but I'm all here for the girls having fun. And so I want to talk a little bit more about this topic. So without further ado, let's get into this excerpt and revisit the conversation. So we've briefly discussed how race-based adultification bias contributes to play inequity. So now I want to talk a little bit more about gender-based bias. And one of the questions I posed in the original essay is this: are girls, and especially girls of color, really more mature, or are we expected to be? So I want to kind of expand on this question a bit because there's a little bit more I want to say about this topic that I don't feel like I fully explained in the way that I wanted to in the original video. I'm going to just use this time here to kind of expand more on how I would answer this question or why I answered the question the way that I did. So I feel like many girls, raise your hand in the comments or in the chat if you have been called so mature for your age. And I wanted to kind of get to the root of why this possibly could be. So my interpretation, the reason I think this is the case, I broke this up into two parts. First being socialization, and the second being biology. And so one of the reasons I think girls are seen as more mature or forced to grow up fast is because activities commonly seen as feminine forms of play are valued less. And so to talk about this, I'm going to use a quote from this book called The Gift of Play by Barbara Brannon, Why Don't Women Stop Playing and How to Start Again. So I put a little explanation warning on this slide because I wanted to make the note here that honestly, I don't love this book in some of the examples she gave in the interviews. You can tell that some of the people they interviewed were of a certain level of degree of privilege or just had similar backgrounds or experiences. Maybe not everybody, but at least from the excerpts I've read, I was getting that sort of undertone. It was very, very early 2000s coded, if you know what I'm saying. I do think that this book brings up some good points, which we're going to discuss, but I do think there's a homogenous, it's homogenous that the demographic that she was interviewing. All right, so long disclaimer. But anyways, let's get into this quote. So this reads, "So often men's play is bigger, grander, and more socially honored. Women often find so much pleasure in so many more simple pursuits." And she gave some examples of simple pursuits being knitting. You can kind of see the age discrepancy of the people she was interviewing. And the other example she gave was women getting together to talk. And so knitting, to kind of bring that into more of a modern 2020 context, I would think maybe the equivalent today would be crocheting or any other crafty activity. I think getting together to talk, that is still very commonly, perceived as a way that women hang out and have fun. And another example that I would personally give that I think fits into this category is shopping. Sometimes that can be seen as a feminine form of play. So back to the quote. Women may have play that does not have crowds standing on their feet to watch them win, or academies giving awards. They often have very, very quiet play. Because it is quiet, many may not receive the value it deserves. Quite frequently, women will not pursue their heart play because they lack the support that comes so naturally to men's play. So yeah, I think this was a good quote to kind of show that sometimes feminine forms of play may not be respected or seen in the same way that maybe common form of men's play is. For example, the stereotypes we see is like men, at the bar watching the football game or in football season. Men working on cars or driving motorcycles, things like that. Not that women can't do those things too, obviously. But the things that we typically associated more commonly with feminine or more softer, quieter forms of play, we typically see people associate these things as a waste of time. Like, why are you wasting money going to Target again? Like, why are you just lollygagging, talking to your friends? Things like that. We definitely place less value on what we deem as feminine forms of play. And obviously this is rooted in misogyny. Let me see your comments. B says, I found out that my mom, who's 65, knitted when she was 8. Very interesting. I wonder if knitting was more popular in that time generation. Yeah, probably so. So you can kind of see, the book was aging itself a little bit. B also says, if men partake in those hobbies, they are mocked, which is upsetting because there's nothing wrong with play that's labeled feminine. Yes, definitely. And I actually have another section later on in the video or later on in the presentation that talks more about the politics of feminine forms of play. So I can't wait to get to that part. But yes, one part of why I think girls are seen as more mature or maybe are expected to be more mature is because feminine forms of play aren't seen as being worth our time as much. Another component to the socialization part is because I think expectations for girls to be mothers, nurturers, and the responsible ones may prevent girls, who will eventually grow up to be women, from truly experiencing an uninterrupted, unrivaled play state. And therefore, because they're not experiencing this play as much, may be seen or labeled as more mature. And so one of the examples I briefly gave in the original essay, but wanted to talk a little bit more about here, is the term eldest daughter syndrome and this phenomena on social media. And so I have a video that explains what eldest daughter syndrome is. I'm just going to play a short excerpt of it, and then we will discuss.
Nice. Eldest daughter syndrome, or EDS, is not an official mental health diagnosis, but it's having a moment right now.
It's a term coined to describe the unique pressures and responsibilities placed onto the oldest daughter in a family.
It relates to the unfair expectations of a young firstborn girl. Things like constant caring for younger siblings and stepping up to help with most jobs around the house.
This is like having the lion's share dumped onto one child, the oldest daughter in the house.
They also say they're the ones responsible for maintaining family harmony.
We can feel like the emotional well-being of our entire family rests on our shoulders. When one of our siblings is upset, we could be expected to go to them, to offer support. And in some cases, we can even be treated like a friend of our parents. The responsibility never ends.
Eldest daughter syndrome is definitely a thing in Australia. Eldest daughters will be very anxious, very stressed. They might be struggling with a lot of guilt. They might be struggling with sleeping. Sometimes eldest daughters might feel like they don't want to have a second family because they feel like they were already the third parent and they've raised their family.
The excessive burdens of EDS are now thought to stifle self-growth, steal childhoods, and can lead to anxiety and resentment later in life.
When you look back, nobody's really looking out for you.
I think the reason that oldest daughters are always kind of a little bit unhinged is because once they hit a certain age, they come into this realization that like, oh, I never was a kid. I never got to be a kid.
The role model, the family therapist, the caregiver, people depend on me. Labeled as a natural born leader, they place on me a crown and I can't take it off. I can't say no.
It's not a mental health condition because it's more of a social expectation. Often girls are socialized into doing more tasks that are considered female, but we need to really undo this thinking that chores are feminine or masculine because these are basic life skills that all people should be able to do.
So first of all, I want to snap to that last quote. chores, domestic tasks should not be seen as feminine. These are life skills. If you are an adult and can't do your laundry, like, I'm sorry, like, if you don't know how to cook one thing, like, these are life skills. Amy says some of that labeling is odd. Yeah, like the gendering of hobbies and stuff like that. Yeah, so we'll talk about that later, but I definitely agree. So one note I did want to give about this video is that they said that the eldest daughter refers to the firstborn girl, but I also want to say that eldest daughter syndrome, or this idea, can apply to whichever is the oldest girl. So even if there are other siblings, if you are the eldest daughter, some of these attributes could apply to you or resonate with you. And that's largely due to how girls are typically socialized, like this video states. So for example, like, I am not the firstborn in my family, but I'm the only girl. So I have all brothers. I have 2 brothers. So eldest daughter syndrome could apply to someone like me, because even though I'm not the firstborn, I am the oldest daughter, or in my case, the only daughter. So I really liked that video because I liked how they talked to mental health professionals, and they included TikTok clips from people just sharing their personal, anecdotal experience. And eldest daughter syndrome is not a official mental health diagnosis, which I'm glad that they mentioned, but it is a sort of a way to encapsulate a cultural expectation. And a lot of that is rooted in how girls are socialized to be more nurturing, to be responsible, to take the high road, to look out for everybody else, and sometimes to the expense of themselves. I want to read this quote from that Gift of Play book that I was talking about earlier that I think touches on this well. And so here's this additional quote. For far too long, women have taken the high road of responsibility, reliability, accountability, and just plain old-fashioned endurance to keep their worlds running. On occasion, they relax, refresh, and re-energize, but usually not well or often, and not in the form that I call heart play. So that is page 13 in the prologue. Yeah. Our socialization, the way that girls are socialized, different from even the boys in the same family, can have different detrimental impacts if not unchecked or processed. There's a lot of ties of this conversation to the parentification conversation as well. And another note that I also was kind of thinking about as I was preparing this presentation is I did a video essay a while back, one of my first few video essays on the channel, about the real gamer stereotype and why for so long women were not included in that definition of gamer. And that video talked about a lot of different things, but also combining this research into it. One of the reasons we may not see women as gamers is because we often teach society that feminine forms of play are less important. So that can even include video games, that we typically prescribe feminine traits, which again, doesn't make sense because games and inanimate objects are not inherently gendered. But also, we kind of teach girls that they should have other responsibilities before play. So that could also be another reason why we don't see girls typically as in the stereotype of a gamer. Even though things are changing, that is another possible component, Let's see, B says, it can be hard to do life skills when you're disabled, but able-bodied people who aren't doing it based on the idea that they don't have to do it is wrong. I write this in good faith. Yeah, that's a good point also about kind of like the ableism perspective. Like, say if you're in a household where I'm laughing because I'm thinking, I watched a video recently about one of my favorite types of videos on YouTube are people analyzing the internet and things that happen on the internet. And somebody was talking about this TikTok video of this guy who was making this video saying how he was surprising his wife by cleaning the house after she had like back surgery. Like if cleaning your own home is like this cute surprise thing you should be doing for your wife. Like if that's not your job too. But that's a good segue because we typically use language such as boys will be boys and in some cases men will be men to excuse irresponsible or quite simply just juvenile behavior that girls and women often don't receive the same grace for. really need to stop normalizing this idea of mediocrity in men. Like, this should not be the standard. The bare minimum should not be the standard for men. Let's keep it a buck. But the other way that I answered this question, the other way I answered this question are girls, and especially girls of color, really more mature or are we expected to be. The second part of this I answered in the video was biology, and I wanted to expand on a little bit more of what I meant. And I kind of rooted this idea, what I said in this idea that girls mature faster than boys. I know we've all heard this. So in the essay, I used like the earlier onset of puberty as the perceived maturity benchmark for girls, not because I think puberty magically makes you grown, but I think some adults who are unaware of their biases may see the physical changes in a girl's body to signify an older cognitive maturity level than what she actually presents. And so the early onset of puberty is more common for Black girls, but of course these are generalizations, so if it don't apply, let it fly. I'm a late bloomer. But you know, this sort of fact of girls maybe hitting puberty faster, and their bodies changing maybe faster than boys' bodies, if you don't uncheck your biases around that, this may contribute to higher levels of adultification bias against girls, and especially girls of color, who typically hit puberty faster. So yes, did I miss anything? OB said something else. Okay, let me read your message. Haha, yes, I think I know what you're talking about. It's like when men do something that's basic and they're praised similar to men raising their children. Yeah, it's kind of giving, like, you know when like men say, oh, I'm like babysitting my kid? Like, babysitting? Like, you mean parenting? Like, that's what you're supposed to do? So, the next thing I want to talk about is another extension of gender. So far in this section, I've been using very binary language when it comes to the social expectations of girls and boys and the ways in which we're socialized, but I also want to be cognizant of those who may not fit into the gender binary, or girls or boys who had a unique experience growing up because of being transgender. And so I looked at two sources to kind of explore this. The first one on the left is a 2024 Spain-based study, so the study was conducted in Spain, from the Journal of Child and Family Studies. So the research was written and conducted by three researchers, Lucia Gonzalez Mendiondo, Nieves Moyano, and Andrew Mayer. I hope I'm not butchering it, but I apologize if I am. And the other source I found, or I watched this documentary, was called Transhood, and is a documentary on Netflix. So the article on the left, or the journal on the left, used a qualitative approach. They analyzed 22 life stories written by parents of trans children and adolescents aged 4 to 18. Three key periods were considered: the period before social transition, the period during social transition, and the period after social transition. And so there's one quote in particular I want to read. So, parental denial and minimization of gender identity is often justified by saying that they are very young and that it is a phase that will just pass. Sometimes this denial is carried out in a subtle way, even with nice words and sweet tones. Not only are they denied their identity, but they are also prevented from certain activities, behaviors, games, toys, clothes, accessories that they request, long for, or demand. And this is a quote from the parents, he's just looking at the girl's clothes, and of course I denied him and forced him to try on things for a boy. He had a terrible time, and I had a terrible time with him. I understood that he was not asking for anything wrong, but it cannot be as he wanted. And so this is in relation to one of the trans girl children. And this particular quote was in the section where they talked about the period before social transition. And so one of the things I do like about this journal is they cover many different stories and perspectives, because obviously, just like any group, there is no monolithic single experience. But I do think that this was interesting to bring up because although you don't have to be trans to experience like play or toy denial, I do want to draw the attention of how this experience may be more prevalent for the trans community. So these sorts of denial experiences are likely to be distressing for young trans kids, especially if they happen frequently and for prolonged periods of time. If you're constantly being denied certain toys and play activities due to the sex that you are assigned at birth, I can see how these sorts of occurrences can prevent kids from fully being able to experience a quote-unquote normal childhood like other kids their age. And of course, this doesn't have to be the case depending on the attitude of the parents or legal guardian or family that the kid grows up in. But that could be a factor of ways that sort of a childhood is maybe interrupted or cut short for this community. Another factor that I also want to talk about was in this documentary to the right. So this documentary follows, I think, 4 or 5 trans kids and their families over the course of 4 or 5 years. And one of the reasons I liked including both of these sources is because they showed dynamic experiences, or different experiences is the word, because obviously there's no monolithic one experience. So just want to make that very clear. And if you have a different experience, or if you are a part of the trans community, feel free to let me know in the comments or in the chat what your experience is, if you feel comfortable, or if you have something additional to add or share, because this is not all encompassing. But another factor that one of the kids in this documentary was talking about is kind of like the expectation, or the unspoken expectation for trans kids to be advocate for transgender issues. And that can kind of take away from these kids just being able to live their normal everyday lives and doing just normal things like their peers do. You know, having to be an advocate, or feeling like you're supposed to be an advocate because of your identity. Or, you know, this particular child was talking about being scared to go to a protest because of potential violence that could be enacted upon them or their family, for this kid simply just wanting to live their life. And so the end of the documentary, this kid kind of came into the realization that she wants to draw back from advocacy work so that they can just live their regular lives and be a kid. And so that sort of unspoken expectation to be the representative of your community, to be an advocate, to talk about, you know, injustice or trauma, could also be a reason why some transgender kids, could feel like they've missed out on maybe typical other childhood experiences that other kids got to experience. B says, I consider myself non-binary, but I do connect with my womanhood, and since I realized my identity later in life. I believe I was socialized as a girl personally, and I would love to read more trans stories. Yeah, so this was definitely, you know, interesting to read about, and thank you, you know, for sharing your story. But yeah, so the way that we're socialized, I think, has such a big impact on the way we perceive play, or what is an acceptable form of play for ourselves. And so I definitely think that's very interesting. But all right, we have made it into the last section of the presentation, and we're going to be talking about inclusive play and the politics of pink. So far we have reframed adult play as a form of self-care. We've discussed play inequity across race and gender, and also expressed concerns about playful states being seen as cringe. So now I want to talk about the importance of inclusive play, and also the politics of pink, or things we deem feminine play activities. This will tie into some of the things we've been talking about previously in the essay. So the kind of inspiration for this section was based in this other comment I got on that original play essay from Junie Back? I'm probably butchering that. I apologize if you're watching this, but let's go. This person left a phenomenal comment, so let's go ahead and read it. So they say, excellent video. We all need to embrace a bit of play even in adulthood. And I agree that people are three-dimensional beings. Just because something is stereotypically girly or boyish doesn't mean you can't have other interests outside of those things. That also means having those stereotypical interests isn't wrong either. We often treat people like they should either be one thing or the other, when in reality, more often than not, most of what we're interested in have more similarities than we'd like to admit. As a guy, my favorite color is pink, and I like watching television shows or playing video games that many would consider feminine. But I also like shows and games that are targeted towards men as well. To me, they are all fun, and I don't try to make excuses as to why I like what I like. the toxic ideas of what we consider masculine and feminine often do more harm than good, and I think that also plays a role in what we consider playful as well. So many phenomenal points. I'm so glad that they left this comment, and I want to land on that last sentence for a little bit. The ideas of what we consider masculine and feminine often do more harm than good and impacts what we consider playful for ourselves, what we consider socially acceptable forms of play. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of how our perception impacts our play. So I feel like gendering as a form of separation first begins in our mind before we see it in the world. And I feel like we have a lot of limiting beliefs. Like I would challenge you guys to ask, like, what sort of limiting beliefs we have about forms of play that are socially acceptable for us due to our identity. So one of the earliest kind of forms of play that we are conditioned when we were younger is this idea of the gender toy aisles. And honestly, I do think that more stores are starting to get away from the gendering of girls' toys and boys' toys. But honestly, in my perception, I still think that these aisles are gendered, even if they don't explicitly say girls and boys. Like, I was in Target. I went to a couple Targets and Walmarts to look at the toy section recently. And I feel like even without the distinctive marking, you can still tell what is for the girls, or what is intended for the girls and what's intended for the boys. But that's just my perspective. But yes, I think this idea of what we deem as socially acceptable forms of play for ourselves first begins very young with things like segregated toy aisles. But the same way that toy aisles are segregated into pink and blue, we can unconsciously segregate leisure activities in our mind. So for example, on the left here, I put the stock image of what we might see a girl group going to do for fun on a weekend. Going to brunch, having a good, yap session, catching up. And on the contrary, we see this group of guys at a sports bar watching the game with their beer. So these sorts of leisure activities, even though we may not be going to pink and blue toy aisles anymore, we can still have this idea of what gendered forms of play look like. I do also want to mention that nobody is forcing you to do anything you're not interested in. Like, if you do not want to watch certain shows or play certain games or do certain activities, nobody is asking you to metaphorically, say, play with Barbies or play with trucks, so to speak, if you don't want to. But what I am offering you is to think critically about whether or not we're holding ourselves back from fully enjoying being in a play state that is true to us simply because of the outside opinion of what is an acceptable form of play for us. So the same way that toy aisles are segregated to pink and blue, we can unconsciously segregate these sorts of leisure activities in our mind. If you want to use a video game example, we can talk about how Animal Crossing can be seen as like a feminine game, or even The Sims, or let's say Dress to Impress. That game has been everywhere recently. And so I say all that to say, I want you to start thinking critically about whether or not we're holding ourselves back from fully enjoying being in a play state that is true to us because of outside perception of what is an acceptable form of play for us. I hope you guys enjoyed that excerpt. If you are interested in engaging in the full live stream, I'm going to go ahead and link it in the description below, because we talked about this topic and many more. We talked about race-based play inequity. I also go into the history of the color pink and how it became a gendered color, which is something that I thought was really fascinating. And we also touch on a lot of other topics. So if that interests you, be sure to check it out. It'll be linked below. And of course, if this type of content resonates with you, do not forget to engage with the video. So leave a like, a comment, share, all of the things. I would love to know what you took away today, or if you learned anything new. And with that said, my name is Asmara, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye everyone.